Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about boundaries specifically. What are they, where they come from, and how to set boundaries. It's going to be a short video, but I think it's going to be very informative. So boundaries, first and foremost, uh, we didn't have them as kids, right? We couldn't have them because we weren't free agents. We were basically dependent on other people. So if you're experiencing an issue with boundaries, like you don't have them or you can't set them properly, that's normal. That's a normal part of human existence because we were conditioned to actually be that way. We had to prioritize attachment over authenticity. And I spoke about this previously, where effectively, if you wanted to be clothed, if you wanted to be fed, if you wanted to be loved, if you wanted attention, you had to sacrifice your own authenticity to maintain that attachment. And then over time, because we've conditioned or we have been conditioned in that way, we learn not to really have any boundaries. So we're just kind of like accepting what everybody else gives us because we think that by doing that, it's not that we think, it's just that we've been trained that by not having boundaries, we're going to maintain an attachment, even if it's an unhealthy attachment, even if it's an attachment we don't necessarily want, but it has certain elements from our past that seem to be beneficial to our survival. That's why you see a lot of people repeat the same relationships or whatever relationships they had with their parents or their caregivers, they end up repeating those types of relationships with partners, right? Or the polar opposite, depending on the presence of your parents, how you were raised, etc. But that's also another reason why we rebel when we grow up, because we want to establish our own identity away from our family. And it makes sense because our prefrontal cortex is developing, we're becoming more intelligent, our rational minds are developing, we become more independent, we become older, so more likely to be able to take care of ourselves. So that all makes sense. Uh, but the issue there also is that when we begin to rebel, sometimes we swing in the other direction and we go from unhealthy boundaries in one way to unhealthy boundaries in another way, where we're just always reactive to people, right? So where is that middle ground? Like we got to find that middle ground. And I think I'm going to give maybe one tip around this, and it's going to help really clear the air as far as boundaries and how to set them. So keep two things in mind, right? The two things that I just mentioned. Number one, not having boundaries or having unhealthy boundaries is normal because of the dynamic that I explained, right? Which is that we were conditioned to not have boundaries fundamentally. And then as we got older, as we started to establish our own identity, we either continued not to have boundaries because of the way we were conditioned, or we were so reactive and so rebellious that we started to have excessive boundaries or what we think are boundaries, but it's really just the pendulum swinging in the other direction where we're more reactive and we don't really have good relationships for that particular reason. But typically, people do have boundaries that are being violated on a regular basis. So, what is the one key point here? Because I always like to get to the essence of things. If you follow this channel, you know that I always like to get to the root of every topic. And the root is what? It's character development, right? It's who you're becoming. It's your identity at a core level and who you are and how you can change separate from the world around you and the world's reactions, right? Other people's reactions to whatever it is that you're doing. So it's really a process of self-reflection, integration, and expansion, and getting the feedback and then organizing that information and then knowing what to do with it so you can actually repeat the cycle, but repeat the cycle in an evolving way, right? Not in a regressive way, but in an evolving way. So in this particular case, what do we do? Well, number one, the most important thing is to know that you have the autonomy, the free will, the power to change the way you're seeing things, to change the way you're seeing things to such a degree where you begin to regard yourself in a different way. So the first thing that you have to do is change the relationship that you have with yourself. If you don't do that, it's going to be really hard to set boundaries. You're going to set a boundary. You're going to say, this is what I really want. Somebody's going to violate it. And because you haven't generated a healthy attachment within yourself, that boundary is still going to be violated. So first thing is first is to establish a healthy relationship with yourself, right? One of compassion, of understanding, of encouragement, simultaneously of discipline, of hard work. So all of these things are kind of integrated together. And then also discovering like what it is that you really want at the deepest level, right? Not at the superficial level, at the deepest level, and how to align that with your actions so that you come closer and closer to whatever purpose or whatever gifts that you have to give to the world, right? So once you start to do all of that, you begin to make more sense. It's almost like you begin to, like yourself becomes more integrated and you make more sense to yourself, if that makes sense. And once that happens, you're going to know specifically what it is that you're going to tolerate, what you're not going to tolerate. So you'll have a better idea of like what's true for you. So who are you authentically speaking? And then once you do that, then is kind of like another difficult step, which is essentially you setting boundaries in such a way where you are determining or you are communicating to other people what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And it's not like every time you set a boundary, you're saying, okay, that's not acceptable, right? You need to change your tone. It's also the way you set the boundary. It's not just that you set boundaries, like set the boundaries. How do you set the boundaries? Are you setting the boundaries in a healthy way? And in a way that's actually mindfully communicating to the other person that you do have this boundary. So keep that in mind. So number one, it's the internal, and number two, it's the external. But that mediation between the two is also equally important, which is how you're communicating that boundary, right? So again, with kindness, with respect, with empathy, but with no wavering on it, right? Like if that is a boundary, you can't waver on it, which means that somebody else's rationality or justifications or logic is not going to compromise that boundary because they may perceive the way you're communicating as a weakness, for example. And so unless you not just set the boundary, but unless you initiate, what's the right word? Unless you act on that boundary, it's not going to be known. And this happened to me in my past as well, where relationships, in fact, my last relationship where I said, if XYZ doesn't change, this relationship is not going to work. And I think I mentioned that like a couple of times. And this was really important around communication. And the relationship ended. And after the relationship ended, it was almost like surprising to the other person, but it wasn't surprising to me. I mean, I think like if you were an external party viewing the relationship, it probably wouldn't be surprising considering that when I say something, I'm serious about it, right? So you have to eventually act on that boundary. And it was super painful. It was really, really painful. And to be fair to the other person, right? Not necessarily my ex, but like the other person that is in your life, they may not have experience with other people setting those boundaries and actually acting on those boundaries when the time comes. And so sometimes you will get into uncomfortable situations, but you have to know that when you act on that boundary, it's because it's coming from a real and true and principled place. Remember, character development and acting in accordance with principles, with strong principles. That's the whole purpose of this, teaching you that you have the tools and then using the tools that you already have internally, right? So when you're acting on that boundary, it's because it's coming from like a real and true and authentic and principled place. And so sitting in that discomfort is going to change you. It's going to evolve you because that's where evolution comes from, right? Evolution is basically there's constraints on the system and the system opens up, and then there's constraints and it opens up. So there has to be the balance of both, right? Because if you acquiesce, then you never complete the cycle, right? And the cycle technically would be completed if the other person respects the boundary, because it makes sense. But if they don't, then you have to complete it away from the other person, right? But sometimes that's the way life works. So I hope that was helpful. It was a pretty short video, but I think it's a topic that I've never seen discussed in the way that I just discussed. So I hope that was helpful. If you want me to expand on this, if you want me to like break everything down in a long video, 20, 30 minutes, like I do in my other videos around confidence, around self-love, around faith, like there's a lot of other videos that I kind of like have full breakdowns of. If you want me to do that, then please leave a comment below and let me know. Otherwise, if you like the video, make sure you like it, subscribe to the channel, check out my newsletter. I publish really good articles there, I think. So you got to tell me if you think that they're good. And yeah, that's it for me. So if you have any other questions, you can DM me on X because I actually am on X. And that's it. I'll see you next time.